Hey, Campus House. I'm sitting here at Fort Weatnan in front of the Wabash River. If you've been around Lafayette very long, you'll know that the Wabash is sort of a running joke. It smells a bit, it's kind of dirty, potentially has genetically mutated fish. All in all, it's kind of treated like an eyesore. But the reality is that even in its current state, the Wabash is an amazing natural landform. It's 500 miles long, discharges water at like 35,000 cubic feet per second. It's home to hundreds of species of birds and waterfowl, from blue heron to bald eagles. There's bullfrogs and newts and crayfish and catfish and otters and bass. What I find so compelling about a natural feature like the Wabash is this gargantuan, this ancient, drawn-out way that it took shape. This river was formed by the same glacier that created Lake Erie. As the Erie section of the glacier melted, it began to form these channels all over the Midwest, and over the course of thousands of years, these streams and lakes and channels, they drained into this 500-mile-long body of water that then empties into the Ohio River. And it's at times like this when, I don't know, I begin to feel how small I am. I begin to recognize the long-mindedness of God. I look at his creation as his playground, and I remember that our God is a patient God. And that these, I don't know, momentary problems and anxieties and this turbulence that I feel, it seems to me that these are like life-shattering, cosmic-level atrocities. But God isn't worried. He's not wringing his hands. He enters into the fray with us, but he's not boxed in by our small conception of time. When I look at the Wabash, I'm reminded that we serve a patient God. He's a God who, when Paul in Romans tells us to rejoice in hope and be patient in tribulation, God's not asking us to do something he has not been practicing for the entire existence of our universe. In fact, in Romans 15, Paul takes it further and says, we serve the God of patience. We serve a patient God. And so that's what I want to spend some time talking about today. Just this idea of patience. We're in a series from 2 Peter, and we're calling it the Summer Renovation Project. And so I'm going to jump in here at 2 Peter 1, verse 2. Grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and his own goodness. Through these he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, escaping the corruption of the world from evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness. To goodness add knowledge. To knowledge add self-control. And to self-control, perseverance. Add to your faith patience. I want to start unpacking this word patience a bit, because I think the idea of patience can be passed off as, you know, that thing your mom told you to do so you'd be quiet while you're standing in line. I think we understand patience as just putting things off, right? Like taking our action out of the equation, letting the world go on its way without us. But the word patience, or in Greek, hupomone, means so much more. Hupomone is the capacity to hold out, to bear up in the face of difficulty. It's patient endurance, fortitude, steadfastness, perseverance in the face of adversity. It also carries this meaning of this act or state of dignified anticipation of what's to come. It's an expectation of hope. Or to kind of bundle all this up to say patience is the posture of faith. Patience is the posture of faith. And so it is not a passivity or an absence of activity. It is instead the profound presence of Christ-embodied fortitude. It's holding on in faithful expectation that God will complete his good work in his creation. I want to make a fairly bold statement, a hot take, if you will. But as I look at the trajectory of Christianity from Jesus on the shores of Galilee to the early church spreading out from Jerusalem to the height of the Roman Christian Empire to the Dark Ages to the Orthodox solidification in the East to the European Reformation and then now to the modern Western church where we sit. As I look at this expanse, I see the apostasy of the church, the place where it's failed its vocation, where it's stopped being the church. This place, it begins when we abandon hupomone, when the church refuses to be patiently steadfast in faith. And I think it often begins with good intentions, right? Christians want to end persecution. They want to spread the gospel. They want to correct wrong ideas about God, fill in the blank. But hupomone, patient perseverance, is a necessary element in this process. It is the posture necessary for faithful obedience. Because when we're not clothed in patience, when we take patience off, we begin to put on other things that are not compatible with following Jesus. To say it differently, as the church, we cannot accomplish our vocation from Christ apart from the way of Christ. We can't obediently accomplish his kingdom mission apart from the means that Jesus lived and the life he invites us to live as the new humanity of God's inbreaking kingdom. And this idea of patience, it was widely accepted in the early church. If we just take a quick sample of some of the early church fathers, we see that admonitions of steadfast, enduring patience are the steady diet of these early teachers. Take, for example, the North African father Tertullian, right? So he's writing in the 2nd century, and for him, patience was inextricable from a work of God. So if patience was not in it, God's not in it. In his words, nothing undertaken through impatience can be transacted without violence, and anything done with violence meets with no success or is collapsed or plunged to its own destruction. But listen to what he says a posture of patience will do in the life of a believer. In poverty, patience supplies consolation. Upon wealth, it imposes moderation. The sick, it doesn't destroy, nor the man in health does it prolong his life. For the man of faith, it's a source of delight. It attracts the heathen, it adorns a woman, it perfects a man. It's loved in a child, praised in a youth, esteemed in the aged. In both man and woman, at every age of life, it is exceedingly attractive. And what's more, Tertullian is not writing this from a place of ease and comfort. He's not sitting where you and I probably are. Instead, for him, in the 2nd century, North African Christians were living under violent pressure from Rome. At this time, Christianity was numerically outnumbered and socially outcasted. And yet, while Tertullian is connected with this, he is not concerned about the future. He believes that God is at work and that patience is God's means of drawing people to himself. And that's just Tertullian. About 100 years later, in the same city, Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, urges us that the instructions on impatient endurance from Jesus, some stuff that we see in the Sermon on the Mount and through his teachings in the Gospels, these are worthless unless we truly live them out. He says that it is this patience which strongly fortifies the foundations of our faith. It's this patience which sublimely promotes the growth of hope. It directs our actions so that we can keep to the way of Christ while we make progress because of his forbearance. It ensures our perseverance as sons of God while we imitate the patience of the Father. Justin Martyr calls the Christian lifestyle that's committed to following Jesus, he refers to it as a strange patience. When speaking about the distinctive Christian approach to conflict, Lactantius refers to it as an invincible patience. For Clement of Alexandria, patience is indispensable, necessary not only in times of persecution, but just in everyday life of a Christian. For Origen, the father of Christian theology, patience is at the core of the church's witness. So to sum all these fathers up, the foundational faith of early Christians was that through his death and resurrection, Christ was reigning. And that in the midst of all circumstances, God is patiently working all things toward his new creation. And their adherence to this faith allowed them to live a revolutionarily patient and potent life. But despite the witness of the early church, as I'm sure you're aware, the church has not always been defined by this same patience. And we could look at any time period, but nowhere to me is the contrast between a patient and an impatient Christianity more clear than the 4th century. The late historian Alan Kreider wrote this book that, it fundamentally changed my perspective on what an authentic Christian posture is in the world. He speaks of the growth of the early church in the first 3 centuries as a patient ferment. Despite the humble beginnings of the church, as well as their tumultuous relationship with the Roman Empire, the church in the first 3 centuries grew in an unparalleled fashion. In my head, I always pictured this period of Christianity as these courageous and charismatic believers shouting to the masses and deriving these intense underground strategies to draw people into the church. But Kreider paints a different picture. For all of the church literature in this period, there are no sermons or transcripts about evangelism or mission strategy, and all the catechisms, these teachings they would give to new believers. There's no admonition for them to share the gospel. There are no famous missionaries or evangelists. There are no large gatherings designed to attract new believers. And these things are not negative, and I think these are good practices, but what is just interesting about this period is that the expansion of the early church was a patient ferment. The church placed all of their effort on being transformed by Jesus to live out this manner of life in the world: generosity, healing, sacrifice, peace, patience. And they lived this life in the midst of the Gentiles, becoming friends, being good neighbors. Their theology was unhurried. It was a theology of patience. For this form of Christianity, the ordinary Christians were the key. So rather than official leaders of these communities, it was the anonymous Christians who were primarily responsible for Christianity's spread. It was the missionary success of the lowly. Just to give you an idea of the scope of this ordinary and patient life of the Christians, historians believe that the spread of Christianity can be attributed to a small, patient, and faithful sharing of life. So over the course of one generation, each man and woman would raise their children in the faith and reach one other person. So the entire spread of early Christianity was reaching someone and raising your children. And so certainly there are exceptions to this rule as the Spirit would prompt and move in people's hearts. But for Kreider, the missional success and values of the early church could be summed up in the word patience. At the bottom line, they trusted that God was at work in their midst, and that their attempts to control or coerce in impatient means that did not reflect Christ would actually be counter to the mission of God. And so contrast this beautifully patient potency with the shifting stance of the church under the rule of Constantine in the early 4th century. Constantine, a pagan emperor who became fascinated with Christian theology and practice, kind of adopted Christianity as his favored religion. He didn't take on the teachings and baptisms of Christianity until his deathbed, didn't make Jesus his Lord, but during Constantine's rule, while he favored Christians, there were these 4 major shifts that he offered the church leaders, options they had not had before. He offered them control, power and resource of the state, violence and coercion, and speed. So with control, before, Christians in their patient hope saw themselves as collaborators with God. So they didn't need to control things. They didn't need to manipulate. But Constantine, leading on some of these impatient reflexes, insisted that humans can plan and control events using whatever means necessary to obtain desired outcomes. He offered them control. He offered them the power and resources of the state. And so before, the generosity of the Christians drew in outsiders, but now they were being offered these immense resources to effect change, where before they would use their own resources for others, but Constantine was inviting them to use the resources of others for their own ends. He offered them religious coercion. He authorized the use of power to crush other groups, people they considered heretics or factions that opposed them. He resorted to torture and murder and violent coercion to protect the wholeness of Christianity. And lastly, and maybe most applicably here, he offered him speed. The early Christians, trusting in God's goodness, appeared to have an unhurried approach to life and mission and kingdom. In contrast, Constantine was in a hurry, and he offered the Christians a faster tempo. Now, not all of Christianity affirmed this impatient posture in the world, and certainly not all of the blame for the woes of Christianity can be placed right here on Constantine's shoulders. But the 4th century represented a major shift in what was available for Christians. Whereas in the early centuries, patience was this defining characteristic, an attribute of necessity and survival, not just a value. But now impatience was on the table. It was now a choice to be made. So back to my hot take. Along with the early church fathers, I see patience as inseparable from the works of God. That when the church refuses Christ's patient example, it begins down a wide path that abandons the way and means of Christ. So what does this have for us today, right? So America is not Rome, and the church is neither persecuted here in the West, nor is it the primary cultural power. But I think that the call to patience is as relevant now as it was in the 3rd or the 4th century. In fact, the greatest threat that I see to Christianity in our current cultural moment is the corruption of our witness. We are part of a church tradition, whether we want to be or not, but we have mastered the art of impatience. With good motives for spreading the gospel, for living moral lives, for seeking the well-being of a nation, or for security for our families, we have taken off the clothing of patience. We saw the progress is too slow, and in its place, what do you see? You see vies for power in government seats and cities and places of power at any cost. We see greed and the love of money corrupting our leaders. We see sexual immorality and abuse. We see inaction and silence in the face of injustice. And as a result, we see generations of Americans who I believe are truly longing for the love and acceptance and the forgiveness of God. They are turning away from the church. They're turning away from the place where they could actually receive it because they're unable to see past our broken witness. Stanley Hauerwas often talks about how Christians set out to make America Christian, but in the process we made Christianity American. And the American Christianity that we see today, it's proof to me that impatience does not work in the long run. So what does it look like for us as individuals and for us as a community to begin to again add to our faith patience, to add hupomone? To start, we can begin asking ourselves, to ask the Lord to highlight places of impatience in our lives. Where am I tempted to take things into my own hands, to control and coerce? Where am I tempted by anxious worry, by toil and striving? Where do we try to achieve good kingdom goals, but apart from Jesus' kingdom way? Secondly, as a community, we can begin asking ourselves the same question. What is our patient witness to our neighbors here at Purdue? Are there ways that we try and accomplish God's purposes apart from His means? Do we devise and strategize our way out of a patient and embodied presence in our communities? As Kreider instructs us, Christians need not be anxious or frantic or impatient, because they can entrust all things, including their own lives and the salvation of all people, to the God who is patiently making all things new. One final word I feel like I need to address because of our current moment. It's so full of injustice and oppression and worry. I need to say that patience does not mean inaction. I take deeply to heart the strong critique, these words from Martin Luther Jr. to the white moderate, who he calls the greatest stumbling block to freedom, the one who prefers the absence of tension to the presence of peace, who prefers to wait for a more convenient time. But what he's describing is not patience. Patience is not the same as inaction. We need to remember this. It's instead a posture in the world that comes from this abiding faith that God is working all things for good, even if we will never see it. Patience requires relinquishing our own plans, our own priorities, our own comfort, and submitting all things to Christ as Lord of our lives. And this posture of patience is an understanding that ultimately it is not up to us, but it's up to God to bring about the fruit. We are collaborators with God. We are not Lord. Jesus is Lord. And so With this posture of patience, we then give everything we have. We give our whole lives for the shalom of our neighbors, our friends, our families, and even our enemies. And so to my friends and my neighbors who've been affected by the coronavirus, maybe you had to add time on to school, or maybe you lost your job, or your life, I'm sure, is inconvenient. I hear you and I see you. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people lament that they are missing out on experiences that other people would normally have, right? They're not getting the full experience on their life that other people get. And I understand that too. I've had my own setbacks, my own inconveniences. But could we together begin to hear this patient invitation from the Lord? This is our life. We don't need to compare it to someone else's. This is where we are, and this is the place where we are going to meet with God. And so can we live with a posture of patient trust in the Lord, living generously, enduring the inconvenience of the season, and even finding the gifts in the midst of it? To my white brothers and sisters, a posture of patience means recognizing that we actually can't save the world. We are not going to single-handedly dismantle every system of oppression. Yet, we must also be willing to lay down our own bodies, our own privilege, our own comfort for the lives of our black brothers and sisters. Neither inaction nor frenzy, but a patient, enduring, radical, actively sacrificial love. I want to close today with a profound invitation from Jesus, from the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to move through this as a prayer, inviting Jesus to form us, like the Erie Glacier formed the Wabash, right? To shape us into a people of patience. Would you pray this with me as I speak this over us? Lord, bless us. We are poor in spirit. We recognize the places of striving and independence that we run after on a daily basis. We see that only you can actually fill our poverty. Help us receive your kingdom. Lord, bless us as we mourn. We mourn our need and brokenness. We mourn the injustice of the world. Comfort us, God. Lord, bless us. We are meek. We see that the world does not understand your patient power. Help us embody this power in your earth. Lord, bless us. We are hungry for justice. Bring an end to the pain and brokenness in the world. Would you strengthen us to sacrifice for this wholeness? We know that you will fill us. Lord, bless us. We are merciful. May our first instinct always be mercy. We know that you will be merciful to us. Lord, bless us. We are pure. Not a purity of isolation, but a purity that intensifies as we participate with you in the messiness of this world. Help us to see you as you are. Lord, bless us. We are peacemakers. Help us to see all people as our siblings, bringing the peace of your kingdom to bear in the world, for we know that we are your children. And Lord, bless us as we suffer. We know that this way of being is antithetical to the powers of this world that thrive on strife and grief and greed and suffering. Show us the way to your kingdom. We ask all of this in your name, Jesus. Would you make us a people of patience? Amen.